The last breath in the bathroom. It began with a child's laughter, soft, innocent, carrying through a sunlit yard. Lila Carter was just 5, her tiny hands busy threading wildflowers into a bracelet. Her grandmother, Margaret, watched from the porch, smiling through the ache of old memories. But laughter can vanish faster than anyone imagines. Margaret stepped inside for a phone call. Minutes later, the gate swung open, and silence swallowed the yard. A doll lay abandoned in the grass, and Lila was gone. Panic spread like wildfire. Neighbors combed the streets, shouting her name. Flashlights cut across ditches and fields. Margaret's cries echoed through the night. And then came the county's most trusted companion, Brutus, the police canine. Scarred, seasoned, relentless. The trail carried him through weeds and rusted cars, right to the door of Derek's decrepit house, the father everyone feared, the man Anna once fled. Officers braced themselves as Brutus scratched furiously at a locked bathroom door. Inside, water filled the tub, towels lay soaked, shards of glass glittered on the floor. Derek called it an accident, but Brutus refused to calm down. His instincts drove him to the rug, where strands of hair and a water-stained bracelet revealed a truth darker than silence. The small southern town stirred slowly each morning, as though time itself moved at half its usual pace. Old sycamore trees shaded cracked sidewalks, their roots pushing through cement like stubborn reminders of the past. On Main Street, a row of tired brick buildings bore faded signs. An old barber shop, a cafe that smelled of fried bacon, a grocery with squeaky doors. Folks here spoke softly, waved at neighbors from their porches, and measured life not in headlines, but in whispers carried by the wind. At the edge of town, where the pavement gave way to gravel and gravel to clay, stood a weathered, clapboard house with peeling white paint. Its porch sagged gently toward the earth, and yet it seemed to carry a kind of quiet dignity, as if it had endured storms without surrendering its place in the world. That house belonged to Margaret Carter, and to the little girl who was her reason for waking each day. Inside, the kitchen smelled faintly of lavender soap and cornbread baked the night before. Margaret moved slowly between the counter and the stove, her silver hair pinned in a loose bun, her hands spotted with age, yet steady as she folded laundry on the table. Her face bore the gentle creases of a woman who had loved and lost deeply, and who now poured what remained of her strength into a single, fragile life. "Grandma," a small voice called from the next room. Margaret looked up, and her eyes softened immediately. Lila Carter, only 6 years old, came skipping in barefoot, clutching a piece of green thread she had been braiding into a makeshift bracelet. Her hair, the same chestnut shade as her late mother's, spilled in tangled waves over her shoulders. "Look, I made another one." She held up the crooked little braid proudly, the knot uneven, the threads sticking out like wild grass. Margaret bent down, cupping the girl's small hand in her palm. "It's beautiful, darling. You've got nimble fingers, just like your mama." The word hung in the air, mama. For a moment, silence wrapped around them, gentle but heavy. Margaret smoothed the child's hair, hiding the flicker of sorrow that rose every time her daughter's memory surfaced. Lila's mother, Anna, had been gone almost 2 years now, taken by an illness that came swift and cruel, leaving Margaret to carry both her own grief and the task of raising the little girl alone. But Lila's eyes, wide and earnest, chased away shadows. She tied the uneven bracelet around her wrist and lifted her arm as though it were a crown jewel. Then she darted to the corner where her worn-cloth doll waited, its button eyes hanging by thread. "Hush now," Lila whispered to the doll, rocking it gently. "Mama says we don't cry. We sing instead." Her voice rose softly, a tune Margaret recognized. It was a lullaby Anna had sung on nights when fever stole her breath. Hearing it from Lila's lips was like reopening an old wound and laying a balm over it at the same time. The melody floated through the small house, thin and imperfect, yet filled with innocence that could steady even the weakest heart. Margaret leaned against the counter, her hands gripping the wood to keep from trembling. She wanted to be strong for the child, always strong. But there were nights when the emptiness was too loud, when she woke to the sound of her daughter's cough echoing in memory. Nights when she wondered how long she could keep the world at bay. Still, she never let Lila see those cracks. Instead, she joined in the song, her deeper, wavering voice blending with the child's high notes. Together they filled the house with sound, not polished but whole. After the song ended, Margaret wiped her eyes with the corner of her apron and forced a smile. "You know, your mama used to sit right there with that same doll, singing until the chickens crowed. I reckon you've got her spirit in you." Lila beamed, unaware of the ache stitched into her grandmother's words. She twirled once, her bracelet jingling faintly as the threads rubbed together, and then collapsed onto the rug with a giggle. Outside, the cicadas hummed, and the sun stretched through thin curtains, painting golden lines on the wooden floor. The world beyond their little house might have been restless, filled with rumors and hard men who drank away their tempers. But here, in this fragile bubble, tenderness still lived. Margaret poured 2 glasses of sweet tea, setting one carefully in front of Lila. She watched the girl sip, leaving tiny fingerprints on the glass. Every gesture, every sound, was catalogued in Margaret's heart like treasures she couldn't afford to lose. "You'll wear that bracelet to church this Sunday?" Margaret asked. "Every Sunday," Lila said firmly, her lips stained with tea. "It's my lucky one." Margaret laughed, the sound low and hushed. "Then I suppose I'll have to keep sewing your dresses strong enough to hold all those lucky charms." For a while they sat in peace, grandmother and granddaughter, the weight of loss softened by the small rituals of life. Song, bracelets, tea, and quiet love. But underneath, Margaret knew a truth she never voiced aloud. Shadows had a way of slipping through cracks, no matter how carefully one sealed the doors. When night came, and the lamps flickered on, she would tuck Lila beneath the patchwork quilt, stitched from scraps of old dresses. She would stroke her hair until sleep pulled her into dreams, and she would whisper prayers into the dark, prayers for protection, for strength, for the kind of peace she had not known since her daughter's last breath. For now, though, Margaret let herself breathe in the moment. The house, modest and weathered, still held warmth. Lila's laughter still rang clear, and though the memory of Anna hovered in every corner, the child's small hands weaving threads into bracelets felt like proof that love could outlast loss, if only they held on tight enough. Morning in the small southern town always began with the same rituals. The bell at the Methodist church rang softly at 8. The mail truck coughed its way down Main Street, and the diner on the corner filled with the scent of bacon and coffee strong enough to cut through sleep. For the locals, the diner wasn't just a place to eat. It was where stories traveled faster than the train that hadn't stopped in years. That morning, Margaret Carter stepped inside with Lila's hand tucked tightly in hers. They had come only for a small errand. Margaret promised her granddaughter a blueberry muffin after picking up fabric at the dry goods store. But the moment the door creaked open and the brass bell above jingled, she felt the weight of every eye turning. People nodded politely. Some smiled at Lila, who clutched her ragged doll and bracelet as if they were talismans. But beneath those gestures, Margaret caught the ripple of conversation shifting, lowering, as though the air itself had grown cautious. At the counter, old Mrs. Whitfield leaned close to her neighbor, her words barely a whisper yet sharp enough to slice through the room. "They say Derek's been back. Saw him near the gas station, buying a bottle late last night." The man beside her shook his head. "That no good never stays gone. Like a storm cloud, he always drifts back." Margaret stiffened, her hand tightening around Lila's so firmly the girl winced. She loosened her grip, but kept her gaze forward, refusing to give the whispers power. Yet inside, her chest ached with dread. She had prayed those rumors were wrong. They found a small booth by the window. Lila pressed her nose to the glass, tracing shapes with her finger, oblivious to the tension threading through the room. Margaret ordered the muffin and coffee, her voice steady, though her stomach turned. From the far corner, another voice rose. "Swear I saw him by Miller's Creek. Looked rougher than before. Same mean eyes." The waitress brought their plates with a smile too practiced, as if she too had heard, and chose not to add her own judgment aloud. Margaret thanked her softly, then tore the muffin in half for Lila. She tried to focus on the simple joy of her granddaughter's delighted hum as she bit into the warm, sweet bread. But the whispers gnawed at her, each word a reminder of a history she wished she could bury. As she stirred her coffee, her mind drifted back to the years when Derek's shadow had darkened their family. He hadn't always been a monster, not in the beginning. He was charming, quick with a smile, the kind of man who could light up a room. Her daughter Anna, so young and hopeful, believed she'd found a forever love. For a while, Margaret had believed it too. But charm soured quickly. The first bruise on Anna's arm was brushed off as an accident. Then came nights when Margaret heard shouting through the walls, the sound of breaking glass, the muffled sobs of her daughter trying to hide her pain. By the time Anna found the courage to leave, she was carrying Lila in her arms and scars on her heart that would never fully fade. Margaret had seen Derek's true face more than once. Wild eyes lit by whiskey, fists clenched like weapons. She remembered standing in her own doorway as he raged, spit flying from his lips, screaming that he would take his family back whether they wanted him or not. Only the sheriff's stern warning had driven him out of town then. Even so, she had never trusted his absence to last. Now, hearing the whispers in the diner, she knew her fear had been justified. Derek was near. Across the table, Lila looked up, crumbs dotting her cheeks. "Grandma, why are people looking at us funny?" Margaret swallowed hard, forcing her lips into a smile. "They're just curious, sweetheart. Don't you worry." But the lie burned her tongue. She excused herself quickly after paying, leading Lila back into the daylight, away from the weight of watching eyes. The street outside was bustling, children chasing each other past the hardware store, men hauling crates from trucks, women exchanging recipes on front steps. But to Margaret, the world felt less safe. Every face blurred into one question. Had they seen him? Was Derek lurking just around the corner? That night, when Lila had been tucked into bed with her doll clutched against her chest, Margaret sat alone by the window. The lamp cast a small circle of light, but outside, the dark stretched endless. She pressed her hands together, knuckles white, and let the memories come. She saw Anna's face the night she arrived on Margaret's doorstep, lips split, eyes swollen, arms cradling baby Lila. "Mama, I can't stay with him anymore," she had whispered. He'll kill me if I do." Margaret had gathered them both into her arms, promising safety she wasn't sure she could provide. And for years, she kept that promise, watching Anna rebuild a fragile life until illness stole her away. Now only Lila remained, and Margaret felt the weight of both protector and parent on her shoulders. The thought of Derek returning to claim rights he had forfeited long ago filled her with a fear sharper than any she had known. As the crickets sang outside, she thought she heard footsteps on the gravel road. She held her breath, peering into the night, but saw only shadows shifting in the trees. Still, the sense of foreboding pressed close, like the storm-laden air before a downpour. Somewhere in town, Derek was moving again. She could feel it. And though she tried to tell herself that the sheriff would keep watch, she knew deep down there were storms no law could stop. She closed the curtains, whispered a prayer under her breath, and glanced toward Lila's room. The child slept peacefully, her small hand curled around the crooked green bracelet. Margaret's heart ached with both love and terror. The whispers in town had become a warning, and in her bones Margaret knew trouble was coming. The evening settled slowly over the small southern town, but there was something in the air that made the dark feel heavier than it should have. The cicadas had fallen silent earlier than usual, and the wind carried a dampness that hinted of storms not yet born. Margaret Carter felt it in her bones as she moved through her modest house, dimming the lamps and checking the locks on every window. In the bedroom, Lila lay curled beneath a patchwork quilt, her doll clutched tight to her chest, and the crooked green bracelet still circling her tiny wrist. The child's lashes fluttered as she fought against sleep, humming the last notes of a lullaby her mother once sang. Margaret sat beside her, smoothing strands of hair back from her forehead. "Close your eyes, darling," she whispered. "The world will wait until morning." Lila yawned, but her gaze lingered on her grandmother. "Grandma, do you think Mama can see me from heaven?" The question pierced like glass. Margaret swallowed the ache in her throat and managed a tender smile. "I believe she never takes her eyes off you. Every time you laugh, every song you sing, your mama hears it. She's proud of you, Lila." The child's lips curved in a sleepy grin, but her eyes shimmered with that quiet longing only a motherless child can know. She whispered into her doll's ear, as if telling a secret, then finally let her eyelids fall. Margaret lingered, listening to the rhythm of her granddaughter's breath. She traced the quilt with her hand, each square sewn from pieces of old clothes. Anna's blue dress, a baby blanket faded by years, her own apron worn thin from countless washes. Threads of the past stitched together to protect the only future she had left. When at last she rose, Margaret hesitated at the doorway, glancing back once more. The room looked fragile in the lamp's glow. Lila's small body lost in the folds of comfort, innocence wrapped in fabric too thin to shield against the dangers waiting outside. Margaret closed the door softly, whispering a prayer under her breath. Across town, another scene unfolded beneath the hum of neon lights. The county sheriff's SUV idled outside a dim roadside bar, its engine low, headlights casting pale beams across the gravel lot. Inside the back compartment, a large German shepherd shifted restlessly, his amber eyes alert, his ears tuned to every sound. Brutus. He had earned his reputation the hard way, tracking fugitives through swamps, sniffing out narcotics in the hollowed frames of old cars, dragging men twice his size to the ground when they thought they could outrun justice. Scars marked his muzzle, thin lines of history etched into fur. But his stance was proud, steady, as though he carried the weight of the badge himself. Tonight he worked alongside Officer Daniels, a broad-shouldered man who trusted Brutus more than any human partner he'd ever had. Daniels leaned against the SUV, watching the bar door swing open. Two men stumbled out, their voices loud with drink. Brutus's ears twitched. A low growl rumbled in his chest. "Easy, boy," Daniels murmured, though he knew better than to dismiss the dog's instincts. Brutus never growled without reason. The bar was known for trouble, fights that spilled into the parking lot, debts settled with fists or worse. Daniels kept a hand near his holster, eyes scanning the shadows. Beside him, Brutus stood taut, every muscle coiled, as if he could see what humans could not. When the drunks finally staggered off into the night, Daniels exhaled, patting Brutus's side. "Nothing tonight, huh? But you're always watching." The German shepherd didn't relax. His gaze stayed fixed on the tree line, on something deeper in the darkness, something beyond the reach of headlights. Daniels followed his stare, but saw only stillness. The dog's quiet vigilance was unsettling, as though he knew a storm larger than bar fights was coming. Back in her house, Margaret sat in the kitchen with the lamp turned low. She sipped cold tea, her hands trembling slightly. The whispers she'd heard at the diner earlier still echoed in her head. "Derek has been seen. Near the gas station. Same mean eyes." She rubbed at her chest, feeling the familiar weight of anxiety settle there. For years, she had tried to believe he was gone for good, that maybe prison or distance, or his own ruin would keep him away. But shadows don't stay buried. And Derek had always been a man who thrived on control. A sound outside made her freeze. The crunch of gravel. She turned off the lamp, heart thudding, and stood still in the dark, listening. Through the curtain she caught a glimpse of the road, empty. Only the swaying branches of the old sycamore in the yard. Still, her nerves would not calm. She walked quietly to Lila's room, cracked the door, and listened again to the child's steady breathing. Relief softened her shoulders. But as she pulled the door shut, a whisper in her mind returned. "If Derek is back, he'll come for her. He always said he would." Margaret pressed her hand to the wood grain of the door, closing her eyes. "Lord, keep her safe," she whispered. "Keep me strong." Across town, Brutus shifted in the SUV, his eyes narrowing at the empty lot once more. To Daniels, the night was quiet. To Brutus, it was alive with warnings, faint scents, a change in the wind, the electric sense of something drawing nearer. The dog lowered his head, but never closed his eyes. Like a sentinel carved from flesh and bone, he stood ready, watching for the danger no one else could see. And so the town, unaware, slipped deeper into the night. Children dreamed, neighbors locked doors, the church bells stilled. In one house, a grandmother prayed over her sleeping granddaughter. In another corner, a police dog stood guard against unseen storms. Between the two, a darkness moved closer, quiet, patient, inevitable. The knock came just after sundown. It was sharp, deliberate, 3 hard raps that rattled the thin wooden door of Margaret Carter's old house. She froze in the kitchen, her hand still resting on the handle of the kettle. Outside, the evening had turned heavy again, the air damp with the promise of rain. The knock sounded once more, slower this time, like a fist that already knew it would be obeyed. Margaret's heart dropped into her stomach. She didn't need to look. She already knew who it was. "Grandma?" A small voice called from the living room. Lila sat on the rug with her doll, eyes wide, sensing the change in the air. "Who's here?" Margaret forced a smile she didn't feel. "Stay right there, sweetheart," she said gently, moving toward the door with legs that felt heavier than iron. The porch light flickered as she pulled the curtain back. There he stood, Derek. Time had not been kind to him. His once handsome face was now a map of ruin. Cheekbones sharp from neglect, eyes bloodshot, jaw covered in uneven stubble. He smelled of stale liquor and sweat, even through the thin glass. Yet behind that wreckage still lingered the same dangerous charm, the same crooked smile that had once fooled her daughter. "Evening, Margaret," he said, voice low and oily. "Long time." Her hand tightened on the curtain. "What do you want?" He leaned close, his shadow spilling across the door. "I came for my daughter. She's mine, and you've kept her from me long enough." The words sent ice down Margaret's spine. She stepped out onto the porch, closing the door halfway behind her. The cicadas were silent again, as if even nature held its breath. "You have no claim here, Derek," she said firmly, though her voice quivered at the edges. "Anna left you for good reason, and Lila is safe with me." His smile widened, revealing teeth yellowed by years of drink. "Safe?" he mocked. "Safe in this rotten little shack with an old woman who can barely walk straight. You think you can raise her better than her own father?" He slammed his palm against the doorframe, making the wood shudder. Margaret flinched but did not step back. She thought of Lila only a few feet away, clutching her doll and listening. That thought steadied her. "You lost the right to call yourself a father the day you raised your hand to Anna," she said, her words sharp as broken glass. "You'll not do the same to her child." For a moment, Derek's face twisted with rage, the mask of charm slipping. But then, he smoothed it over, his voice shifting into something almost tender, practiced. "Now don't be like that, Margaret. I've changed. A man can change, can't he? I just want a chance to see my little girl, to hold her. Don't I deserve that much?" The manipulation made Margaret's stomach churn. She had seen this game before. The soft voice, the pleading eyes, the promises that vanished the moment he got what he wanted. She remembered the bruises on Anna's arms, the nights filled with screaming, the terror that clung to her daughter even after she escaped. "No," she whispered. Then louder. "No. You don't deserve her. Not now. Not ever." Derek's smile died completely. He leaned in so close she could smell the whiskey on his breath. "You can't keep her from me. She's mine, and I'll come back for her. You can't stop me." Margaret held his gaze, though her knees trembled. "If you try, the sheriff will. And you know, Brutus won't hesitate." At the mention of the canine's name, something flickered in Derek's eyes. Fear, maybe, or memory. He stepped back, his fists clenching at his sides. For a heartbeat, the world stood still. The crickets muted, the air heavy, two figures locked in a silent war on a sagging porch. Then Derek spat on the ground, his voice a growl. "You'll regret this, old woman." He turned sharply, his boots crunching against gravel as he stalked into the night. Margaret stayed frozen until the sound of his footsteps vanished down the road. Only then did she allow her hands to shake, gripping the doorframe for support. She wanted to collapse, but she couldn't. Not yet. Inside, Lila peeked from the corner, her eyes huge and wet. "Grandma, who was that man?" Margaret knelt, pulling her close. She pressed her lips to the child's hair, breathing in the innocence she was determined to protect. "Nobody you need to worry about, my darling," she murmured, though her own voice shook. "Nobody at all." But as she held Lila against her chest, she knew the lie would not hold for long. Derek had returned, and with him came a storm that no lock, no prayer could keep out forever. The diner was louder than usual that Saturday morning. The smell of frying bacon and coffee clung to the air, mingling with the hum of conversation that spilled from every booth. Farmers in dusty boots leaned against the counter. Church ladies fanned themselves with laminated menus, and children scribbled pictures on napkins while their parents caught up on news. In a town like this, the diner wasn't just where you ate. It was the stage where everyone's lives played out, rumor by rumor, story by story. Margaret Carter stepped through the door with Lila's small hand clasped in hers. She had hoped for a quiet breakfast, some semblance of normalcy after the encounter on her porch. The child skipped beside her, clutching her ragged doll, unaware of the storm that had begun circling their lives. But the moment Margaret spotted him, her breath caught in her throat. Derek. He stood near the counter, voice already raised, arms gesturing wildly as he spoke to anyone who would listen. His hair hung in greasy strands around his face, his shirt wrinkled, and his eyes shone with the sharp gleam of a man who believed rage alone could restore the power he had lost. "I'm her father!" Derek barked, slamming his fist on the counter so hard the silverware rattled. "That little girl is mine, by blood and by right, and you all know it." A hush fell briefly, broken by murmurs that ran through the room like ripples in water. Some shook their heads, muttering under their breath. Others exchanged looks of unease. Old Mr. Grady, who had lived through enough town scandals to know better than to meddle, said quietly, "Blood doesn't mean much if you're poison to your own." But others weren't so quick to condemn. A woman in a faded floral dress whispered to her neighbor, "Well, he is her father. Maybe he just wants a chance. People can change." The words stung Margaret. She tightened her grip on Lila, guiding her toward a booth in the back, away from the storm gathering near the counter. But it was too late. Derek had seen her. His eyes locked on hers, and a grin split his face, sharp, mocking. He stepped forward, weaving through tables, ignoring the uneasy glances thrown his way. Conversation stilled as he closed the distance, his boots striking the floor with the rhythm of a man who believed the room belonged to him. "Well, well," Derek drawled, his voice dripping with false charm. "If it isn't Margaret and my sweet little girl." Lila shrank behind her grandmother, clutching the doll to her chest. Margaret's shoulders stiffened. She looked up at Derek, her voice firm, though her hands trembled beneath the table. "Leave us be, Derek. This isn't the place." But Derek only laughed, spreading his arms as though the whole diner were his audience. "Not the place." "Oh, I think this is exactly the place. Folks ought to hear the truth, that you've been keeping my daughter from me, that you've been poisoning her against her own father." The room grew tense. Some stared openly, others looked away, uncomfortable. A few nodded faintly, perhaps out of pity, perhaps out of fear. The weight of judgment pressed down on Margaret's shoulders, though she knew too well how little they had seen of the man Derek truly was. Sheriff Whitaker entered then, the brass bell above the door jingling softly. He was a broad man with tired eyes, the kind who had seen enough of human folly to measure his words carefully. He paused when he saw the scene unfolding, his gaze shifting from Margaret's pale face to Derek's swaggering frame. "Derek," the sheriff said evenly, stepping closer. "That's enough." Derek turned, a sneer curling his lips. "Enough No, Sheriff. Enough is when a man's allowed to see his child without interference. Enough is when folks stop treating me like a criminal and remember I've got rights. The sheriff's expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened. You've got a record, Derek, and everyone here remembers why Anna left you. Rights don't wash away history. The mention of Anna's name sent a flicker of something, anger, grief, shame, through Derek's eyes, but he buried it beneath a snarl. He jabbed a finger toward Margaret. She's filling that child's head with lies, turning her against me. But I'll fight this. I'll fight until my dying breath, and I'll win. A murmur ran through the room. Some faces hardened with disapproval, others softened with misplaced sympathy. Margaret sat silent, her hand covering Lila's trembling one, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break her ribs. The sheriff moved closer, lowering his voice just enough that only Margaret could hear as he leaned toward her booth. "Keep your doors locked, Margaret," he murmured. "And don't let her out of your sight. He's looking for a crack, and he'll take it the first chance he gets." Margaret nodded faintly, her throat too tight for words. She knew the sheriff was right. Derek, satisfied with the chaos he had sown, threw his hands up dramatically and stormed out of the diner. The bell clattered against the glass as the door slammed behind him. For a long moment, silence lingered. Then, slowly, conversations resumed, though softer than before, each table heavy with unease. People avoided Margaret's gaze, some out of pity, others out of quiet blame. Margaret lifted her coffee cup with a steady hand, though inside she trembled. Across from her, Lila's wide eyes brimmed with fear. "Grandma," she whispered, "why is he so angry?" Margaret reached across the table, smoothing the child's hair with her palm. She forced a gentle smile, though her chest ached. "Because he doesn't understand love the way he should," she said softly. "And because some men mistake anger for strength." Lila nodded, still clinging to her doll. Margaret sipped her coffee, but it tasted bitter now. The room that once carried laughter and warmth felt colder, as though Derek had stolen the light when he left. She knew the sheriff's warning was not a suggestion. It was a promise. Trouble wasn't on the horizon anymore. It was already here. The house was quieter than usual that night, but quiet did not bring peace. It was the kind of stillness that made every sound sharper, every shadow heavier. The floorboards groaned beneath Margaret's slippers as she moved from window to window, checking each latch, tugging each curtain shut, until not even a sliver of moonlight could slip inside. She paused at the front door, her trembling hands sliding the chain into place, then tested it twice. Beyond the glass pane, the gravel road stretched into darkness, lit only by the pale glow of a street lamp at the corner. She thought she saw movement once, something shifting at the edge of the yard, but when she blinked, it was gone. Her pulse wouldn't slow. She whispered to herself, "Just the wind. Only the wind." In the living room, Lila slept on the couch, wrapped in a blanket Margaret had pulled from the cedar chest. She had begged to stay close tonight, afraid of the angry man who had shouted in the diner. Margaret didn't argue. She stroked the girl's hair until her eyelids grew heavy, until her breaths fell into the rhythm of sleep. Now, Margaret stood over her, watching. The little girl's chest rose and fell softly, one hand clutching her doll, the other still wearing the crooked green bracelet. Margaret reached down, pressing her palm gently against Lila's back, as if to shield her from dreams. "Lord, keep her safe," she whispered. "Keep him away." But she knew prayers could not stop a man like Derek. She had seen it before, his temper exploding like fire, his fists slamming through walls, his words laced with venom that cut deeper than any blade. She had seen Anna shrink under that rage, her own daughter trembling with fear she tried to hide. And she had sworn, when Anna was gone, that Lila would never endure the same. Margaret sat in the rocking chair beside the couch, the old wood creaking softly as she lowered herself. She pulled a quilt around her shoulders and stared at the darkened windows. Her mind would not rest. Each creak of the house became a threat. Each brush of wind against the siding, a possible footstep. She thought of the sheriff's warning at the diner. Keep your doors locked. Don't let her out of your sight. His voice had been steady, but his eyes had betrayed the truth. He knew Derek's kind. He knew men who believed blood gave them license to destroy. Margaret's hands clenched the fabric of the quilt until her knuckles ached. She felt the weight of years pressing down, every mistake she hadn't prevented, every loss she hadn't stopped. First her daughter, now the threat of losing her granddaughter. Was she strong enough to stand against this storm? The clock on the mantel ticked louder with each passing minute. Midnight came and went. Outside, a dog barked in the distance, then silence again. Margaret rose once more, unable to sit still. She checked the back door, jiggled the lock, slid a chair against it for good measure. She pulled the curtain aside briefly, her breath fogging the glass, half expecting to see Derek's silhouette lurking by the shed. Nothing, only the whisper of the trees swaying in the night breeze. Still, she could not shake the feeling of being watched. She returned to the couch and sat on the edge, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from Lila's small body. The child stirred slightly, mumbling something in her sleep. Margaret bent low, catching fragments of words. "Mama, don't go." Her throat closed. Tears blurred her vision, but she forced them back. She pressed her lips to Lila's temple, whispering fiercely, "I'll never let him take you. Never." In that moment, her fear crystallized into resolve. She was old, her body frailer than it once was, but she would fight with every breath she had if it meant protecting Lila. She would bar the doors, call the sheriff, plead with the courts. And if none of that was enough, she would stand in front of Derek herself. The rocking chair creaked again as she settled back into it, her hand resting lightly on Lila's blanket. She prayed once more, not for herself, but for strength. Strength to carry the weight of guardianship. To face the man who had already destroyed so much, to keep one more innocent life from being shattered. Outside, the sycamore tree shuddered in the wind. The old boards of the porch groaned, as though bearing invisible footsteps. Margaret closed her eyes, but did not sleep. She knew this was only the beginning. Derek's knock on her door had been the first warning. His outburst in the diner the second. The storm was gathering and soon it would break. And when it did, she would have to hold the line, for herself, for her daughter's memory, and for the child sleeping just an arm's length away. The afternoon sun spilled gently over the Carter house, painting the yard in shades of gold. The cicadas droned lazily from the trees, their endless hum a lullaby for a town that had grown too used to quiet. Beyond the fence, the gravel road shimmered in the heat, though a faint breeze carried the smell of honeysuckle and cut grass. In the yard, Lila Carter sat cross-legged in the grass, a crown of wildflowers spread around her like jewels. She hummed softly, her high voice drifting in and out of tune, the same lullaby her mother once sang to her. In her small hands, she worked carefully, threading the stems of daisies and clovers into the crooked green bracelet already tied around her wrist. Each knot was imperfect, each twist messy, but to Lila it was treasure. "Hold still," she whispered to her doll, propped up against a flower pot. She slipped the new chain of blooms around the doll's faded neck. "Now you're beautiful. Mama says flowers make everything better." The doll's button eyes seemed to stare back at her, tired but loyal, and Lila smiled. She picked another daisy and tucked it behind her own ear, pretending she was a princess in a storybook. For her, the yard was not just a patch of earth. It was a kingdom, alive with magic. The bees buzzing near the clover were her knights, the butterflies her dancers, the wind her song. On the porch, Margaret leaned against the railing, watching. Her heart swelled at the sight. For a moment, the fears of the past days fell quiet, drowned out by the simple innocence before her. She thought of Anna, her daughter, gone too soon, and how much of her lived on in this child. Lila had the same eyes, the same way of humming when she was lost in thought. Margaret pressed a hand to her chest, feeling both grief and gratitude mingle in equal measure. The screen door banged softly behind her as she turned to fetch a pitcher of lemonade from the kitchen. The phone rang just as she stepped inside, the shrill sound slicing through the gentle afternoon. Margaret frowned. It was rare for anyone to call at that hour. She set the pitcher down and picked up the receiver. "Hello?" It was Mrs. Whitfield from church, her voice quavering as she rambled about the choir schedule for Sunday. Margaret forced herself to listen politely, nodding though the woman couldn't see her, glancing through the kitchen window to make sure Lila was still in the yard. She saw her granddaughter twirling with her doll, the flower crown slipping lopsided across her head. Relief softened her shoulders. "Yes, I'll bring a casserole for the potluck," Margaret said absently, eyes still on the yard. "Yes, I'll remind Pastor about the hymn change." But the conversation dragged on. Mrs. Whitfield's chatter meandered from hymns to the leaky church roof to the scandal of Mrs. Miller's son being seen drunk again by the river. Margaret's patience frayed. She kept glancing out the window, watching Lila gather flowers near the gate. A shadow crossed the road, though Margaret didn't notice it. Lila, still humming, didn't either. She crouched low, tugging at a stubborn dandelion that had rooted itself in the gravel near the fence post. She set it carefully atop her doll's lap, as if it were a gift. The gate, not properly latched, swayed slightly in the breeze. Inside, Margaret's fingers tapped restlessly on the counter. She tried to end the call politely. "Yes, thank you. I'll make sure to pass that along. Of course. God bless." Finally, she hung up, relief rushing through her chest. She poured 2 glasses of lemonade and carried them toward the porch, smiling faintly as she thought of Lila's delight. But when she stepped outside, her smile faltered. The yard looked the same at first glance. Flowers scattered in the grass, the doll propped up against the pot, sunlight gilding everything in a warm glow. Yet something was wrong. The air felt thinner, too quiet. The humming had stopped. "Lila?" Margaret called, her voice lifting uncertainly. No answer. She set the glasses down, her heart skipping. She scanned the yard again, more closely this time. The doll still wore its crown of daisies. The bracelet of clovers lay half-finished on the grass. But the child, the heart of the scene, was gone. The gate at the edge of the yard stood ajar, creaking faintly in the breeze. Margaret's breath caught. She staggered forward, calling again, louder now. "Lila!" The name tore through the still air, startling a crow from the sycamore tree. It flapped away with a harsh cry, the only answer Margaret received. Her chest tightened with panic as she rushed to the gate, her eyes scanning the empty road beyond. The gravel stretched silent in both directions. No child, no footprints she could see. Only absence. Her hands trembled against the wood of the gate. For one dizzying moment, she felt the world tilt beneath her feet. This was how it happened. This was how the darkness crept in. One phone call, one careless moment, and the fragile world she had fought so hard to protect was broken. Margaret's knees weakened. She clutched the fence post for support, her breath coming fast, ragged. She wanted to scream, but her voice was trapped, strangled by terror. Somewhere, deep in the silence, she thought she heard a faint sound. Laughter or crying. She couldn't be sure. But it was already fading, swallowed by the afternoon. "Lila," she whispered, the word cracked, fragile. The yard, once a kingdom of flowers and play, now felt like a battlefield after the fight. Abandoned toys, fallen crowns, a silence too deep to be natural. The ordinary afternoon was gone. In its place, a nightmare had begun. For a few heartbeats, Margaret stood frozen on the porch, unwilling to believe what her eyes told her. The glasses of lemonade still trembled in her hands, condensation dripping onto the wood rail. But she couldn't move. The yard, Lila's little kingdom of daisies and play, was too quiet, too still. Her gaze darted to the spot where her granddaughter had been only moments ago. The crown of flowers still lay in the grass, half woven, petals already wilting in the sun. Beside it, the doll slumped against the flower pot, its button eye staring blankly at the sky. But the child herself, the light that made it all alive, was gone. The glasses slipped from Margaret's grasp, shattering against the porch. Lemonade spread across the boards, glistening like spilled sunlight. She didn't even notice. "Lila!" Her voice cracked the silence, startling a flock of sparrows into flight. They scattered into the sky, but no child came running. Margaret rushed down the steps, her knees aching, her breath uneven. She stumbled across the grass, calling again, louder this time, desperate. "Lila! Baby, answer me!" The only reply was the groan of the gate swinging on its rusty hinge. It had been left ajar, swaying faintly in the breeze like an open mouth, mocking her. Margaret clutched the wood, her nails digging into the splinters, and peered out at the gravel road. Empty. Panic erupted inside her chest, wild and suffocating. She turned back, eyes sweeping the yard again. "Lila!" Her gaze fell to the doll lying abandoned in the grass. Its daisy crown had slipped sideways, its stitched smile fixed and cruel in the sunlight. Margaret dropped to her knees, snatching the doll up, pressing it against her chest as if by holding it she could somehow pull Lila back too. The earth beneath her seemed to tilt. "No, no, no!" Her voice was a whisper, breaking apart like dry leaves. Memories of Anna's last words clawed at her. "Mama, keep her safe. Don't let him near her." Margaret had promised. She had sworn it with every fiber of her soul. And now, in the span of a single phone call, she had failed. Her breathing grew shallow, frantic. She rose unsteadily and staggered through the yard, her eyes darting to every corner, behind the shed, under the sycamore, along the fence. No trace. The silence pressed tighter, crueler, as if the world itself were conspiring to hide the child. The neighbor's dog barked from across the way, a long, mournful sound that deepened the dread in Margaret's chest. She clutched the doll tighter, spinning toward the gate once more. The gravel road stretched both ways, endless in its emptiness. The sun, once warm, now burned harsh and unfeeling. Every shadow seemed suspicious, every rustle of leaves a taunt. "Lila!" she screamed again, the name tearing at her throat. Her voice carried over the fields, echoing back faintly as if mocking her. Her legs weakened. She dropped to her knees in the dirt by the gate, her hands pressed into the earth. Tears blurred her vision, dripping onto the stones below. She felt the walls of her world collapsing, the fragile life she had tried to rebuild after Anna's death crumbling in an instant. And somewhere, deep inside, the knowledge bloomed like poison. Derek. She didn't need proof. She didn't need to see his face. She felt it in her bones. He had been here. He had taken what he believed was his. The sound of hurried footsteps snapped her head up. Mrs. Whitfield, the churchwoman who lived down the lane, came rushing toward her, apron still dusted with flour. "Margaret, what's wrong?" "She's gone," Margaret gasped, clutching the doll so tightly its fabric strained at the seams. "Lila, she was right here." Her words broke off in sobs. Mrs. Whitfield's face paled. She looked toward the open gate, her lips parting in horror. Oh, dear Lord. Within minutes, other neighbors emerged, drawn by the cries. Men in work boots, women with aprons, children clinging to skirts. The yard filled with voices, rising in confusion and alarm. Questions flew. Where was she last seen? Did anyone pass on the road? Did she wander toward the creek? Margaret could hardly answer. Her chest heaved, her mind racing with images she could not bear. She clutched the doll, rocking back and forth, whispering her granddaughter's name like a prayer. Lila, Lila. The world spun around her. The ordinary afternoon, once so bright, had become a nightmare. The flowers scattered in the grass looked like remnants of a ceremony, a cruel memorial for a child stolen from her own yard. The silence in the yard was no longer simple quiet. It was accusation. It screamed louder than any voice. You weren't fast enough. You weren't strong enough. Margaret pressed her face into the doll's fabric, the scent of grass and sun still clinging to it. It was all she had left to hold. And above the chaos, above the cries of neighbors and the questions without answers, one truth echoed mercilessly in her heart. The storm had broken, and it had taken her granddaughter with it. The first wail of the siren cut through the twilight like a blade. It rose sharp and urgent from the far end of town, echoing over the fields and bouncing off the old sycamores. For years, sirens had been rare in this place, reserved for barn fires, highway accidents, or storms that turned rivers wild. But now, as the sound grew closer, it carried something far heavier, the unspoken dread that a child was missing. Margaret stood in the yard, her legs trembling beneath her, clutching the ragged doll as though it were the only anchor left in the world. Her neighbors had fanned out with flashlights and lanterns, beams of light slicing across fences and hedgerows. The air filled with voices calling Lila's name, each echo a reminder of absence. "Check the creek," someone shouted. "She might have gone toward the orchard," another voice called. Margaret could barely breathe. She pressed her palm against the gate, her eyes scouring the dark road, her heart refusing to accept what her mind already knew. Lila hadn't simply wandered off. The siren grew louder until the sheriff's SUV turned onto the lane, red and blue lights flashing against the trees. Gravel crunched as the vehicle stopped at the edge of the yard. Sheriff Whitaker stepped out, his face grim, the brim of his hat casting a shadow over his eyes. Two deputies followed quickly behind, radios crackling at their belts. And then the back door of the SUV opened. A large German shepherd leapt gracefully to the ground, his dark coat glinting in the lights, muscles taut beneath his frame. His amber eyes scanned the yard with the sharpness of a blade drawn in silence. This was Brutus, the county's K9 legend, The dog whose instincts had uncovered drugs hidden in church basements, whose nose had led officers to fugitives in swamp thickets no man dared tread. Tonight, his presence brought a strange mixture of relief and terror. Relief, because if any living creature could find a missing child, it was him. Terror, because his very arrival meant the town had already accepted the truth. This was no ordinary game of hide-and-seek. "Margaret." Sheriff Whitaker's voice was steady, but his eyes carried sorrow. He walked toward her slowly, as though afraid his words might break her. "We're going to find her." Margaret shook her head, clutching the doll tighter. Her lips moved, but only broken whispers came out. "She was just here. I turned my back for a minute. She was just here." Her knees buckled. The doll slipped from her arms, falling into the dirt. She crumpled beside it, her hands pressed to her face as sobs shook her small frame. Neighbors rushed forward, lifting her gently, murmuring comforts that felt empty against the roar of her grief. Brutus stood at the edge of the scene, ears pricked, body tense. He looked toward the gate, nose twitching, then let out a low growl that silenced the crowd. His handler, Officer Daniels, crouched beside him, clipping the long tracking lead to his harness. "All right, boy," Daniels murmured. "Find her." Brutus lowered his muzzle to the doll in the dirt. He sniffed deeply, nostrils flaring, then moved to the patch of grass where the half-finished bracelet still lay. He paused, ears twitching, before jerking forward suddenly, pulling hard against the leash. The deputies followed with flashlights, beams bouncing wildly against the road. Neighbors pressed closer to the fences, whispering prayers, some holding hands. Children were pulled back by anxious parents, their wide eyes reflecting the flashing red and blue lights. Margaret lifted her head long enough to see Brutus straining against the lead, his bark erupting once, sharp and commanding, as if to say the trail was real. She staggered forward, reaching for the sheriff's arm. "Please," she begged, her voice raw. "Don't let him take her. Don't let Derek." The sheriff gripped her shoulders firmly. "We'll bring her back, Margaret. But you have to stay here. Let Brutus do his work." Her tears blurred the world, but she nodded, too weak to argue. She watched as the dog and deputies disappeared into the night, their lights cutting into the darkness like fragile swords. The echoes of their footsteps faded down the gravel road. The yard, moments ago alive with Lila's laughter, now felt like a stage after tragedy. The flowers lay crushed, the doll abandoned, the quilted innocence of childhood torn open. Margaret sank into the rocking chair on the porch, her body hollow, her soul clinging to the faintest shred of hope. From the road came the sound of Brutus barking again, distant, urgent, unstoppable. His voice carried across the town, a sound that was neither comfort nor despair, but a vow. The search had begun. The night pressed close around them, thick with humidity and silence, broken only by the crackle of radios and the shuffle of boots on gravel. Flashlights cut narrow beams through the dark, slicing across tree trunks and fences. But the true center of the search was not the men who carried them. It was the dog who walked ahead, head low, shoulders taut, every sense burning like a live wire. Brutus. Even in the dim light, he was unmistakable. A massive German shepherd with a broad chest and a coat of black and sable that gleamed when the beams struck it. Scars traced faint lines along his muzzle and left shoulder, reminders of battles fought in service to this county. To the deputies, he was more than a canine, he was a legend. Stories of his work were told in quiet admiration at the station, how he had tracked a fugitive 3 miles through swamp mud, how he had pulled a drowning boy from the riverbank, how no one had ever seen him give up once his nose was set on a trail. Tonight, his eyes glowed amber beneath the sweep of the flashlights, steady and unblinking, as though he alone could see the path invisible to human sight. His handler, Officer Daniels, kept a firm grip on the long lead clipped to his harness, but even he knew Brutus was the one in command now. Daniels knelt, holding out the small cloth doll Margaret had clutched earlier. Its fabric was damp from the grass, its crown of daisies wilting, but the child's scent still clung to it. Brutus lowered his head, nostrils flaring as he inhaled deeply, the muscles along his back rippling with tension. For a long moment, he stayed perfectly still, ears twitching. Then, with a sudden pull, he jerked forward, nose dragging along the ground, body taut like a drawn bow. "He's got it," Daniel said, his voice grim but steady. The deputies fell in line behind them, their flashlights sweeping side to side. Margaret, standing near the porch, clutched the railing with both hands as she watched the dog surge into motion, her heart hammered with desperate hope. Brutus moved fast, his paws barely making a sound against the gravel. He pulled hard enough that Daniels had to brace himself, stumbling once as the dog cut sharply toward the open gate. Past the yard, the trail grew clearer, sharper. Brutus's breathing grew loud, heavy, each inhale pulling the child's scent deeper into his lungs, fixing it like a compass point. They passed the sycamore trees, shadows flickering like restless spirits. The night was alive with faint noises, the chirp of crickets, the rustle of leaves. But the men heard none of it. All their focus was on the dog at the front, whose every movement carried purpose. "He's locked in," one deputy muttered. Brutus veered off the road, nose pressed to the dirt where faint impressions marked the earth. To human eyes, they were nothing but scattered scuffs in the gravel. To Brutus, they were clear as footprints in snow. He let out a low bark, tugging hard to the left, toward the narrow trail that wound toward the outskirts of town. Daniels gritted his teeth, tightening his grip. "Easy, boy. We're with you." But there was no easing. The dog surged forward, muscles rippling beneath his coat, tail stiff with focus. The leash strained, dragging Daniels and the deputies into the darkness beyond the safety of the road. At the porch, Margaret's legs gave out beneath her. She sank to the steps, hands clasped tight around the doll she had picked back up, her eyes locked on the sight of the dog disappearing into the night. She whispered a prayer into the still air, her voice breaking. "Bring her back. Please, Lord, let him bring her back." Brutus didn't look back. He never did. Once he had the scent, the world narrowed into a single path. The smells of the town, smoke from chimneys, the sharp tang of gasoline, the sweet rot of fallen fruit, faded into nothing. What remained was the faint, precious thread of a child's presence, fragile as gossamer, yet undeniable. He followed it with relentless precision, each step carrying him further from safety and closer to truth. Behind him, the deputies' radios crackled with updates, voices reporting that more neighbors had joined the search, that cars with high beams were sweeping the nearby roads. But none of it mattered as much as the pull of the dog at the front. Brutus led them past rusted cars sinking into weeds, past half-collapsed sheds that smelled of mold and oil. He paused briefly at each fork, circling once, nose low, then surged forward again with certainty. His growls deepened when the trail sharpened, when the child's scent grew stronger. Daniels exchanged a glance with the sheriff, who had caught up with the group. Whitaker's jaw was clenched, his flashlight beam steady. If Brutus is pulling like that, she was here not long ago. Daniels nodded, breathless from the pace. He doesn't lie. He never lies. The sheriff's gaze hardened, his voice a low growl. Then let's move. If Derek's got her, we're on borrowed time. The men quickened their steps, the beams of their flashlights bouncing wildly across the darkened trail. The sound of Brutus's panting filled the night, rhythmic and determined, a drumbeat of resolve. He tugged again, harder this time, almost dragging Daniels off his feet, toward the outskirts of town, toward the place where shadows thickened and silence grew heavy. Margaret could no longer see them, only hear the faint echoes of barking carried on the wind. She pressed her forehead to the porch railing, her tears falling freely now. In her mind, she saw Anna's face, pale and tired, whispering the words she had never forgotten. "Mama, don't let him near her." And as Brutus pulled the search deeper into the dark, Margaret clung to the single fragile truth that kept her from breaking. The child was not alone. Somewhere out there, her granddaughter's scent lingered on the earth. And a scarred, seasoned dog had sworn to follow it, step by step, until the trail ended. The trail pulled them away from the heart of town and into the forgotten edges where time itself seemed to have stopped. Here, weeds grew tall and thick, their dry stalks whispering against one another as the night wind shifted. The beam of each flashlight cut through the darkness in shaky arcs, bouncing off rusted metal and broken glass. Every sound, every crunch of gravel, every snap of a twig echoed louder than it should, as if the land itself was holding its breath. At the front, Brutus moved like a machine built for one purpose. His nose pressed low, tail stiff, body coiled with intent. The leash strained against Daniel's grip, as though the dog was dragging the entire search party by sheer willpower. His paws found the trail without hesitation, weaving through weeds, circling when necessary, then surging forward again with certainty. "Easy, Brutus," Daniels muttered, though his words carried no command. They were more for himself than the dog. He trusted Brutus's instincts more than his own eyes. The weedy field opened into a wide lot, where skeletons of old cars rested half-buried in grass. Their frames, eaten by rust, leaned at odd angles, headlights shattered like blind eyes. Some still bore faded paint, red, green, blue, bleached pale by years of sun and rain. The air smelled of oil and iron, sharp and metallic, a scent that mixed uneasily with the sweetness of honeysuckle drifting from the fence line. Brutus slowed only briefly, circling one of the cars, nose tracing along the door. His breath puffed white in the cool night air. Then, without warning, he growled low, his hackles rising, before pulling hard toward the far side of the lot. Daniel stumbled, catching himself just as the leash snapped taut. "He's locked in," Daniels called to the sheriff, his voice tight. Whitaker's flashlight swept across the cars, the beam catching broken windows that glimmered like shards. "Keep on him. If she came this way, he'll tell us." The deputies fanned out, their lights flashing across the overgrown field. A raccoon darted from one of the cars, startling one of the younger men into cursing. But Brutus didn't flinch. His focus was absolute, his nose dragging him further, past the cars and toward the hulking shape of half-collapsed sheds at the edge of the lot. The sheds had once belonged to a lumber yard, long abandoned when the business moved closer to the highway. Their roofs sagged under the weight of years, tin sheets curling away like peeling bark. Graffiti marked the walls, names and curses scrawled in faded spray paint. Brutus barked once, sharp, commanding. Daniels tightened his grip as the dog lunged forward, dragging him toward the sheds. The deputies swept their lights across the open doors, their beams cutting through dust and cobwebs. Inside, the shadows stretched long, broken boards jutting like bones. The smell here was different. Damp, sour, tinged with the faint musk of animals that had made homes in the ruins. Brutus shoved his nose against the ground, pulling them deeper. His breathing grew harsher, louder, each exhale a drumbeat of urgency. Daniel's arm ached from the pull, but he held firm. "He's hot on it," Daniel said, his eyes flicking to the sheriff. "She came through here, Sheriff. I'd bet my badge on it." Whitaker's jaw clenched. He swept his flashlight across the dirt floor of the shed, pausing where faint impressions marked the earth. Scuffs, small enough to be a child's shoes, blurred but undeniable. "Sweet Lord," he muttered under his breath. Margaret's house wasn't far as the crow flew, but standing here in the hollowed ruins, it felt like another world. This place had been abandoned by time, left to rot. No child should ever have walked through it. And yet, Brutus's every muscle said she had. The deputies followed as the dog pulled them past the sheds and deeper into the back lot. Brutus paused again, near a rusted oil drum, sniffed hard, then let out another growl. His body stiffened, and for a heartbeat, the men froze too. The silence pressed heavy, broken only by the distant wail of another siren in town. Then Brutus jerked sharply to the right, pulling toward a gap in the fence line. The weeds here were crushed, pressed flat, as if someone had forced their way through. Daniels crouched, shining his light over the trampled grass. Someone came this way, small prints, child-sized. Whitaker's voice dropped, low and grim. "Then we're not far." The deputies exchanged tense glances. The weight of those words settled like stone. Not far. It meant hope, but it also meant danger. If Derek had her, if he was dragging her through these forgotten places, time was running short. Brutus barked again, his deep voice rolling through the night like thunder. His ears were forward, his tail rigid, every line of his body demanding they move faster. Daniels rose, tugging the leash just enough to keep from being pulled off balance. "All right, boy," he said, his voice steady now. "We're with you. Lead the way." The dog surged through the gap, the deputies following close behind, their flashlights bouncing wildly across the tangled weeds. Behind them, the abandoned lot stood silent once more, the rusted cars and broken sheds watching like witnesses too old to care. The trail was sharper now, undeniable. Brutus knew it, the officers knew it, and somewhere deep in her bones, Margaret, waiting back on the porch, would know it too. The child had been here, and the scarred shepherd was determined to bring her home. The trail pulled them through the last stretch of weeds, through the torn fence line, and onto a narrow dirt path that wound into the shadows of the outskirts. The air here was heavier, thick with the smell of damp earth and mildew, the kind of scent that clung to places abandoned by time and conscience. And then, looming ahead in the flashlight beams, Derek's house appeared. It wasn't much more than a shack, wooden boards warped by years of neglect, windows cracked or covered with plastic sheeting, shingles missing from the roof like teeth knocked out in a fight. The porch sagged dangerously, its railing leaning outward, and the yard was littered with broken bottles and rusted cans. The place looked like it had given up on being a home long ago. But Brutus stiffened, his ears pricking forward, his muscles vibrating with tension. The dog's growl started deep in his chest, low and menacing, before spilling into the night like a warning bell. He yanked hard against the leash, dragging Daniels forward, his eyes fixed on the warped front door. "He's onto something," Daniels said, his breath sharp. Brutus lunged again, his paws clawing at the porch steps, his growls rising into sharp, furious barks. He scratched at the door with such ferocity that splinters flew, the sound of his claws raking against wood chilling every man present. The deputies exchanged grim looks. They had seen Brutus determined before, but never like this. Tonight, He wasn't just tracking. Tonight, he was demanding to be let in, as if he already knew what waited behind that door. Sheriff Whitaker moved up the steps slowly, his flashlight beam steady on the doorframe. He paused, his jaw tightening as he took in the peeling paint, the stains along the wood, the faint smear of something darker near the handle. He turned back to his men, his voice low but carrying. "This is it." The deputies shifted uneasily. One adjusted the grip on his shotgun. Another wiped sweat from his brow despite the coolness of the night. The weight of what they were about to face pressed on them all. This wasn't just a search anymore. It was confrontation. Daniels tried to steady Brutus, kneeling beside him, but the dog refused to calm. His eyes blazed in the flashlight beams, his body a coil of rage and urgency. He barked again, claws tearing at the wood, his tail rigid, every line of him radiating a single truth. "She's in there." "Damn," one deputy muttered, glancing at the sheriff. "If the dog's this riled up..." Whitaker cut him off with a glance. "We go in careful. No mistakes." The team moved into position with the fluidity of men who had done this before. One deputy circled to the back, another covered the side window, their flashlights darting through the cracks. Daniels wrapped the leash around his wrist, trying to hold Brutus steady, but the dog's body shook with growls that wouldn't quit. From inside the house came nothing but silence. Not a creak, not a whisper. Just the hollow stillness of a place that didn't want to give up its secrets. That silence was louder than any noise, a suffocating absence that made every man's heartbeat thunder in his ears. Whitaker raised a hand, signaling the breach. The deputies lifted their weapons, breath tight, shoulders squared. Daniels leaned closer to Brutus, whispering, "Easy, boy. Just a second more." But Brutus didn't want to wait. He threw his body against the door, claws raking so hard it sounded like knives against bone. His bark thundered through the night, echoing off the trees, a primal cry that made even the seasoned deputies flinch. Inside, there was still no response. The sheriff's hand lowered. His voice was a gravel whisper. "On my count. 3, 2, 1. The battering ram struck, the door shuddering against the force. Brutus surged forward, teeth bared, growling with a fury that matched the crash of splintering wood. The deputies poured in behind him, flashlights slicing through the darkness inside. And Margaret, though she was miles away, would later swear she felt that exact moment, the instant Brutus's bark split the night, as if her soul knew her granddaughter's fate was being uncovered. The first blow shook the rotten frame, a deep thud that reverberated through the night. Splinters flew from the door as the battering ram struck again, then again. Brutus barked with each impact, his body lunging forward, muscles straining against Daniel's grip, as if he'd tear the door down himself. On the fourth strike, the frame gave way with a crack like a gunshot. The door slammed inward, bouncing against the wall. Deputies surged inside, flashlights slicing across the dark. The stench hit first, mildew, sweat, sour alcohol. The living room was chaos, bottles rolling under boots, cigarette butts overflowing from a rusted tin, a sagging couch gutted of stuffing, wallpaper peeled in strips, wood beneath darkened by mold. But Brutus wasn't interested in squalor. His nose dropped low, nostrils flaring, dragging Daniels through the wreckage. He barked once, sharp and furious, then lunged down the hall. At the end of the corridor, he stopped so abruptly, Daniels stumbled. A growl rose in his chest, filling the narrow space. He raked claws at a swollen bathroom door, paint chipped, a cheap brass knob rattling under his assault. "It's locked," a deputy muttered. Brutus barked again, claws ripping grooves deep into the wood. "Bathroom," Daniels said grimly. The dog didn't move, locked in place, every sense screaming this was it. Whitaker stepped forward, his flashlight steady. A thin line of water seeped beneath the door, trickling onto warped floorboards. Battering ram. Steel struck wood. Once. Twice. On the third blow, the lock snapped. The door slammed inward. The smell punched them. Mildew, stagnant water, the sour breath of something left too long in the dark. Brutus lunged through, paws skidding across wet tile. He circled the tub, snarling, then ripped at a sodden rug. Daniels yanked hard on the leash, but Brutus fought like a storm, claws tearing fabric, growls reverberating off tile and mirror. Flashlights revealed the scene. Tub nearly full, water cloudy and grey, towels sodden and twisted on the floor, a cracked mirror glinting with fractured light. Bits of hair floated near the drain. No child, only absence, a void louder than any scream. "Jesus," one deputy whispered. Brutus barked at the rug, claws shredding, until water seeped from warped boards beneath. His body shook with rage, as though he would dig the truth out with his own teeth. Then, boots creaked in the hall. A voice drew from the doorway. "Well now. Looks like y'all let yourselves in." Derek leaned against the frame, a smirk under his unshaven jaw. His shirt clung damp to his chest, eyes glinting with mockery. Hands raised lazily, he looked more amused than cornered. "Where is she, Derek?" Whitaker's voice was steel. Derek's glance flicked toward the tub before sliding back. "Accident," he said smoothly. "Girl slipped. I tried to help. Towels prove it. Poison wrapped in honey." "You expect us to swallow that?" Colin snapped. Derek shrugged. "I'm her father. Who else would care enough to wash her? Old woman can't keep up. I was doing what needed doing." Brutus erupted, barking, lunging, leash snapping taut. His teeth flashed inches from Derek's leg. Daniels struggled to hold him back. Derek flinched. His smirk wavered. "Keep that mutt away from me." "That mutt," Whitaker growled, "has more truth in him than you ever will." The deputy's beam swept over soaked towels, broken mirror, stagnant tub. Every detail screamed of struggle. Brutus shoved his nose into the rug, clawing furiously. With a violent rip, fabric tore free. Something small glinted in the flashlight beam. A deputy crouched. "Sheriff, look." Brutus nosed it forward. A strand of chestnut hair rose in the water, fragile and fine. Too fine to be anyone but a child. Whitaker's hand trembled as he bagged it, his jaw locked tight. Brutus pawed again, growling, until another object slid free. Crooked, handmade, threads of green yarn, knots uneven, frayed at the ends. A bracelet. The very bracelet Margaret had tied around Lila's wrist that morning. Silence crushed the room. Deputies shifted, jaws tight, eyes hard. Collins cursed under his breath. "That's it. That's hers." Brutus barked, chest heaving, eyes blazing at Derek. Whitaker held the damp bracelet up, his voice low and cutting. "Explain this." Derek's smirk faltered. His eyes darted, lips stammering. "Kids drop things." "Maybe she—" Brutus lunged again, his bark exploding against tile, vibrating through every man's bones. Daniels hauled him back, barely. Whitaker sealed the bracelet into a bag. His gaze burned through Derek. "This is enough to take you in." Derek's face twisted with rage. "You got nothing but scraps. Don't prove a damn thing." But the silence that met him was heavier than any gavel. Deputies leveled their eyes, steady and cold. Brutus sat finally, body trembling, gaze never leaving Derek. His growl simmered low, a vow that this wasn't over. Whitaker tucked the evidence away, his voice flat. "Cuff him." Chains rattled. Derek fought, shouting denials, but every word rang hollow. The deputies filed out through the rotten hall, boots heavy. Daniels ran a hand down Brutus's scarred back. "Good boy. You did it." But Brutus didn't relax. His amber eyes burned holes through Derek's back. He knew. This was only the beginning. The bracelet was bagged, the strands of hair carefully sealed, yet Brutus's growl still pulsed through the bathroom like a living presence. Deputies moved slow and deliberate, their flashlights steady. Sheriff Whitaker's voice cut the silence. "Get him out." Two deputies seized Derek by the arms. He resisted, shoulders tight, jaw clenched. But when Brutus barked, deep and thunderous, Derek flinched like a cornered animal. "Don't touch me," he snarled, twisting against their grip. "You got it all wrong." They dragged him down the hall, his boots scraping across warped boards. His voice rose with every step. "That bracelet, she dropped it days ago. The hair. She lived here before, didn't she? What's the surprise you find something of hers?" The living room reeked of sweat and liquor. Empty bottles littered the sagging couch. Outside, red and blue patrol lights pulsed through the cracked windows. When they shoved him onto the porch, the small town was waiting. Neighbors crowded fences and porches, whispering in clusters, eyes wide. Derek seized on them. "I'm her father," he shouted, his voice raw. "My own flesh and blood. And this is what I get. Accused like some stranger. You all know me. I wouldn't hurt my little girl." But the words rang hollow. Everyone remembered Anna's hidden bruises, his nights of shouting, the way he vanished leaving wreckage behind. Still, a few faces faltered, old pity clashing with memory. Derek's voice turned slick, almost pleading. "She slipped," he cried. "That's all it was. Kids slip, don't they? She hit her head and I panicked. I didn't know what to do." His tone cracked from rage into false sorrow. "I'm not a monster. I was trying to help her." Whitaker's jaw tightened. "Enough." But Derek thrashed harder. "You think some mangy dog knows more than a father? That animal's wrong." Brutus lunged, snarling, teeth flashing under the lights. Daniels hauled him back, but the growl vibrated through the boards, silencing the crowd. And then Margaret appeared, carried by a neighbor. Her frail frame staggered forward, the doll clutched to her chest. "You took her," she whispered, trembling. Derek's eyes twisted. "I didn't. You poisoned her against me. You're the reason she's gone, old woman." The cruelty cut like glass. Margaret collapsed into sobs, her knees buckling until a neighbor caught her. Whitaker stepped between them, voice cold. "You'll answer in court, Derek, not here." Deputies dragged Derek down the steps. He roared, spittle flying. "This is a mistake. You'll see." But the evidence bag in Whitaker's hand, the bracelet, the hair, spoke louder than his words. The night pulsed with tension. Patrol cars lined the gravel lane. Radios crackled. Neighbors whispered prayers. Derek's ruin of a house blazed with red and blue. And then Margaret faltered. She had insisted on coming, her shawl clutched tight. But when she saw the cluster of uniforms and Derek's muffled shouting inside the SUV, her strength broke. Her knees buckled. The doll slipped from her arms into the dirt. She collapsed, breath shallow, vision spinning. "Margaret!" a neighbor cried. Deputies rushed, lifting her gently to the roadside grass. Water was fetched. Her shawl loosened, but she did not stir. And then Brutus moved. Breaking from Daniel's side, the German shepherd padded toward her. Lowering himself, he pressed against her leg, warmth steady through her dress. His muzzle brushed her hand. The crowd hushed. Even sirens seemed to fade. A scarred K9, fierce minutes ago, now offered silent comfort. Margaret stirred. The first thing she felt was not hands lifting her, but Brutus's steady weight. Her trembling hand clutched his fur, fingers sinking into his coarse sable coat. Brutus didn't move, amber eyes locked on hers. Whitaker knelt beside her. "Margaret, you're safe. We've got him." Her lips trembled. "And my Lila?" Silence. Whitaker's eyes fell. No words could fill the void. Tears slid down Margaret's cheeks. Still, her hand clung to Brutus like a lifeline. Neighbors wept softly. Margaret pressed her forehead to the shepherd's head. "You found her, didn't you, boy? You found my Lila." Brutus exhaled low, a sound like a sigh, and leaned closer. Detectives arrived quietly, their unmarked sedans shifting the scene into investigation. Harris and Lane moved with practiced efficiency, cameras flashing, gloves snapping, evidence bags filling. They documented the shards of glass, the damp towels, the clawed rug Brutus had torn aside. Harris lifted a strand of chestnut hair into a bag. Lane sealed the small green bracelet. "Personal, not planted," Harris muttered. "These belong to her." But his next words hung heavy. "No body." That absence was louder than any evidence. Without the girl, doubt lingered. Outside, Whitaker briefed District Attorney Henson, who had driven in at once. The wiry man listened as the sheriff laid out the canine trail, the evidence, the history of violence. "It's strong," Henson said, "but not ironclad. Without a body, they'll claim accident, misunderstanding, coincidence." He sighed, eyes hard. "I can win, but it won't be easy." Meanwhile, Brutus sat near the patrol cars, restless. His chest heaved, his fur damp, but his gaze never left the house. He knew the work wasn't done. Inside, Harris bagged one last piece. A small footprint pressed into damp tile. Perfect, undeniable. He stared at it, throat tight, before sealing it away. When they emerged, Margaret still sat wrapped in her shawl, Brutus pressed against her. She looked hollow, yet anchored by the shepherd at her side. Lane approached Whitaker, holding up the sealed bags. "It's enough to indict," he said quietly. "Simple doesn't matter," Whitaker replied. His eyes lingered on Margaret. "We owe her the truth." Derek's shouts still echoed from the SUV, fists pounding glass, voice hoarse with denial. But the evidence glinted in deputies' hands. Silent rebuttals to every word. At the DA's office, evidence lined a long oak table. Photographs, reports, sealed bags. Henson braced his hands against the wood. "This is what we've got," he told his assistants. "A canine trail, physical evidence, a history of violence. Nobody. That's their weapon. We must make sure it doesn't break us." He lifted the bracelet bag, threads glistening under harsh light. "This is the voice of a child who cannot speak. If we do our job, this bracelet will be louder than any excuse that man can give." Silence filled the room. Each person felt the weight of carrying justice without certainty. Back in the kennel, Brutus lay restless, ears twitching at every sound. He had dragged truth into the light, but seemed unwilling to rest, as though he knew the fight wasn't over, not until the courtroom doors opened. And in her home, Margaret sat by Lila's empty bed, quilt folded neatly, doll clutched tight. She whispered into the silence, "Don't let him take her memory, Lord. Don't let him twist it into something it wasn't." The battle had begun. Not in Derek's ruined house, but in courtrooms and evidence tables, in the fragile hearts of jurors. And in the shadows stood Brutus, the scarred shepherd, the silent witness, whose bark had carried the truth further than any man's words. Morning light came thin and respectful through the courthouse windows, laying pale ladders across oak floors. The room held its breath the way a church does before a hymn. Polished wood gleamed. The flags stirred in the slow churn of ceiling fans. People dressed like it mattered. Sunday jackets, modest dresses, work boots scrubbed clean. Because when a town sits to hear the fate of a child, even silence wears its best. The clerk called the case. Judge Harland, broad-shouldered, weathered kindness in his face, glanced over rimless spectacles toward counsel tables. On the state side, District Attorney Paul Henson arranged files with the care of a fragile ceremony. Across from him, Derek Cole sat in a suit that didn't quite fit, tie knotted too tight, working his jaw like a man chewing wire. His lawyer, Mr. Collier, smooth-faced and smooth-voiced, conferred in low tones. In the first row, Brutus lay at his handler's boot, head between his paws, eyes awake. The shepherd seemed to take in the room without moving. Jurors, judge, defendant, as if scenting something the rest of them couldn't name. Daniels's hand rested on the dog's withers. Brutus didn't look back. His gaze held toward the empty witness box, as if waiting for truth to take its seat. The jury looked like a town's ledger written in faces. A mail carrier, the high school librarian, a young mechanic with a softness he hadn't learned to hide, an older woman whose hands bore nicks from canning peaches and peeling kindness into jars. None of them glanced at Margaret when she entered and sat in the second row with a folded handkerchief. Not because they didn't see her, but because they did, and didn't trust their faces to hold. "Mr. Henson, you may proceed," the judge said. Henson rose without thunder, without march. Just quiet, iron steadiness, letting the room find stillness around him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "you're going to hear a story about a house with peeling paint and a bathroom where water stood, towels soaked through, a mirror that broke like some men break promises, jagged without apology." His eyes met each juror gently. "You'll hear about a child. You won't hear her voice. Others must speak for her." He opened a shallow box and lifted a clear sleeve, a small green bracelet, its uneven knots darkened by water. "This bracelet was on Lila Carter's wrist the morning she vanished," Henson said. "That afternoon, it was pulled from beneath a soaked rug in the defendant's bathroom. Not on a sidewalk, not lost in a pew. In his bathroom, under a rug, wet from a tub nearly filled." A faint murmur, then quiet. He lifted a second sleeve, chestnut strands whispering against plastic. "Hair, a child's, found clogged in the drain." He let simple sentences sit. "You will hear from officers who followed Canine Brutus from Margaret Carter's gate through abandoned lots to the defendant's front door. You will see photographs of the soaked floor. When confronted, the defendant called it an accident. You will hear the history that makes that word too small." He breathed. "Human," not theatrical. We don't have a body. We would trade every piece of this evidence to change that. But what we do have speaks, in a room where water stands, in a rug that tries to swallow what it cannot erase, in a bracelet a little girl tied herself. Our case is simple. The defendant, Derek Cole, abused and killed his daughter. We will prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. He sat. Fans turned. A clock's soft tick kept time with the room's pulse. Collier buttoned his jacket, rising with a man's ease who knows rooms. Empty hands, theater of sincerity. "Good morning," he smiled, warmth that didn't reach his eyes. "Let's start where Mr. Henson ended. There is no body." He let that hollow widen. "This case is built on fear, grief, and interpretation," he said, gesturing toward Derek, now scrubbed, chastened by solemn furniture. "My client is a father, flawed, yes. The state will parade his past like a traveling show, but fatherhood isn't erased by mistakes. On the day in question, a child wandered." Under pressure, the sheriff followed a dog through weeds and rust and memory. In a rundown house, they found things they think tell a story. A child's trinket that could have been dropped at any time, hair, the most common trace in any home where a child once lived, water on a floor with bad plumbing, a mirror broken long before. They cannot show you how, when, or even if a crime occurred. They cannot show you where this child is. He lowered his voice as if confiding. They ask you to fill gaps with feeling, with anger, with ache. But your oath is not to feeling. It's to evidence, to certainty that rises above doubt. If you are left with questions, and you will be, your duty is clear. He straightened. Derek Cole is a grieving father. He did not murder his child. He sat. Derek exhaled like a man who'd been underwater. For a beat, the room existed between two stories, equal in shape, unequal in weight. Brutus lifted his head. Small motion, quiet muscle shifting, amber eyes traveling from witness stand to defendant and back, as if noting where weather would gather. The front row felt it. The feed store couple, the librarian, Daniels who knew the hum of the dog's breath. Brutus didn't growl. He just watched the place where testimony would arrive like rain. "Call your first witness, Mr. Henson," Judge Harlan said. Henson stood, resting his palm on the bracelet box. Across the aisle, Margaret's fingers tightened on a handkerchief she'd embroidered, Lila, each stitch a prayer that refused to fade. Outside, a dove called from the courthouse oak. Inside, the oath book opened, pages thin as breath. The air smelled of lemon polish and the starch of hard decisions. Brutus settled at Daniels's boot, patient as creatures who know how to wait for truth to find its voice. "The court calls Mrs. Margaret Carter," the bailiff announced. For a moment, Margaret didn't move. Her lips worked as though whispering to someone no longer present. Then she rose. A neighbor steadied her elbow as she walked. Plain cardigan, grey hair pinned with care, the dignity of a life stitched to survive breaking. The clerk swore her in. Her "I do" cracked, but carried a strength beyond a body's strength. "Mrs. Carter," Henson said gently, "tell the court about your daughter Anna." "Anna was my only child," Margaret said, eyes shining. She had a laugh like spring water. She wanted nothing more than to love and be loved. She thought Derek would protect her. A tremble. It wasn't long before the truth showed. "She was hurt?" Henson asked. Margaret looked at the jurors. He was violent. When the drinking started, the shouting followed. When shouting wasn't enough, he raised his hands. I saw the bruises. She hid them under sleeves. But her mother knows. The gallery rustled. The judge's gavel brought stillness. "I begged her to leave," Margaret said. "She said he promised to change. He cried. He said he was sorry." A whisper. "He never was." "Did she leave?" Henson asked softly. "Yes." Margaret's shoulders straightened. "She came to my door with Lila in her arms. Her face was swollen, her lips split. No suitcase, no coat, just the baby and what she wore. She stood shaking and said, 'Mama, I can't do it anymore. He'll kill me if I stay.'" The chairs shifted, stones of words collecting in pockets. "I let her in," Margaret said. "Locked the door. I swore I'd never let him near them again." Henson's tone turned grave. "After your daughter's passing, what role did you play in Lila's life?" "I raised her," Margaret said, voice both proud and broken. "Packed lunches, tucked her in, taught her to thread flowers into bracelets like Anna used to." She swallowed. "She was my joy, my reason." "Did Derek attempt to re-enter Lila's life?" Henson asked. "Yes," Margaret said, shaking. "He pounded on my door. Shouted she was his. I told him no. The look in his eyes, cold, angry, the same look Anna described before she ran." Her composure faltered. Tears welled. She pressed the handkerchief to her face. "I failed them," she whispered. "I failed my Anna. And now my Lila." Even the bailiff shifted, jaw tight. At Daniels's feet, Brutus lifted his head, amber eyes fixed on Margaret, steady, unblinking. Daniel's hand brushed an ear. The dog settled again, gaze never leaving her. "Mrs. Carter," Judge Harlan said, voice soft but firm. "You have not failed. Take your time." Margaret lowered the damp cloth. Lila's letters blurred by tears. When she spoke, her voice carried a fierce tremor of truth. "All I ever wanted was to keep her safe." But the man sitting there, her trembling finger pointed to Derek. "He is why my daughter is in the ground, and my granddaughter is gone. Don't let him charm you. Don't let him twist the truth. He will smile, cry, beg, but I have seen what's behind his face. It's darkness." Silence held. "No further questions," Henson said. Margaret slumped back, spent, handkerchief clutched to her chest, like the last firm thing in a shifting world. At the defense table, Derek shifted. For the first time, the mask slipped. Collier rose. He smoothed his tailored suit, arranging his features into sympathetic gravity. He came forward slowly, resting a hand on the jury rail, confiding rather than interrogating. "Mrs. Carter," he said, voice like silk on wood. "We are sorry for what you've endured. No one questions your love." Margaret nodded, lips pressed. "Love can cloud judgment," Collier murmured, "especially when grief is involved." "Grief doesn't change the truth," she said. "Of course," Collier smiled thinly. "You said your daughter came injured and frightened. You saw bruises. Yet, no medical records, no photographs, no police reports." "Anna was afraid," Margaret said. "She didn't want to make it worse. Or," Collier turned to the jury, "she exaggerated. Young couples fight. Words get heated. You, as a protective mother, might have seen a scrape and believed the worst. Isn't that possible?" "It wasn't a scrape," Margaret said, breathing quickly. "I know what I saw. I know what I heard. What you believed you saw. What you believed you heard," Collier said mildly. "But there's no evidence, is there? Just your word against his." "Objection. Argumentative," Henson snapped. "Sustained," the judge said. "Rephrase." "Mrs. Carter," Collier said, voice smoothing. "You've called Derek dangerous. Yet after Anna's passing, you pursued no restraining order, no custody petition. Why not, if you truly believed he was a threat?" I prayed it wouldn't come to that, Margaret said. I thought if I kept her close, watched the doors, it would be enough. You thought, Collier said, brow furrowed with feigned care. But thoughts and fears aren't facts, are they? A low rumble started in Brutus's chest. Daniel's hand calmed the fur, but the dog's eyes didn't leave Collier. I know the kind of man he is, Margaret said, because of the stories your daughter told. Collier leaned in. Stories you alone heard. Or because it's easier, in grief, to believe in a monster than face the possibility your granddaughter's disappearance was a tragic accident. The blade hung. Margaret's face crumpled. Tears spilled. She shook her head. Words stuck. Collier turned open palms to the jurors. This is not malice. This is a grandmother's pain. Pain distorts memory. It can turn accidents into accusations. She isn't lying. She believes what she says. But belief is not proof. Chairs creaked. Expressions locked. Henson stood. Objection. Counsel is testifying. The gavel cracked. Mr. Collier, finish your questions. Collier nodded. Mrs. Carter, you want justice. We all do. But isn't it possible, just possible, that grief has convinced you of things that cannot be proven? Margaret's hands trembled around the handkerchief. She looked at the jury through tears, voice breaking, but clear. I may be old, I may be grieving, but I am not blind. My daughter ran from him. Now my granddaughter is gone. Call it what you want, but I know what it is. And so does that dog. Brutus lifted his head fully, gaze locking on Derek. The silence deepened, as if every heart recognized the weight of instinct over argument. Collier's rhythm faltered. He cleared his throat, adjusted notes. No further questions. The judge dismissed Margaret. She rose slowly, hand on the rail, handkerchief pressed to her chest. Stepping down, she looked at no one, until Brutus. The shepherd held her gaze, steady, unyielding, as if promising her that her truth hadn't been lost in the storm of twisted words. She returned to her seat. The fans kept turning. Outside, the dove called again. Inside, the scales waited, arms level, listening. Not for thunder, but for the quieter weight of what endures when performances end. A bracelet, a thread of hair, a room that remembers water, and a dog who, even at rest, keeps watch. The courthouse had seen dogs before, guide dogs at civil hearings, therapy dogs in recess, but never a presence like Brutus. By special order of Judge Harland, the scarred shepherd was permitted inside, a rare concession born of his remarkable steadiness. He lay in Daniel's boots, a dark coat catching the light. His head rested on his paws, ears twitching with every cough, every shuffle of paper. Still as stone, yet everyone felt him, the weight of a watchful eye. The trial dragged into its second week. Detectives, forensic experts, neighbors, all added pieces to the mosaic. Yet Collier, Derek's smooth-faced lawyer, leaned on the same gap. No body. Jurors listened, grave, their eyes drifting, always, to the shepherd. That day, Derek sat straighter than usual. Collier had coached him to soften, to look like sorrow. He even tried a smile, thin and oily. Then it happened. During Collier's cross of Detective Harris, arguing contamination of evidence, Derek smirked. Subtle, but there. Disdain, triumph, the curl of a man who'd fooled before. The room might have missed it. Brutus did not. The shepherd's head lifted. Amber eyes locked on Derek. Muscles rippled. He rose, ears pricked, a growl rolling deep and steady. The sound sliced through Collier's questioning. Papers froze. Harris stopped speaking. Jurors snapped toward the dog. Brutus did not bark. He only stood, gaze fixed, the growl vibrating like thunder before a storm. Derek's smirk vanished. Shoulders tensed. His hand gripped the table edge. The courtroom froze. Even Judge Harlan's gavel hesitated. Silence burned between growls. Daniels laid a hand on Brutus's back. "Easy, boy." The dog obeyed, the growl fading, but his eyes never wavered. Jurors shifted, startled yet sharpened. Some leaned forward, reminded of something evidence could not hold. Instinct. Collier cleared his throat, voice cracking. Animals, of course, react to all kinds of things. But no one believed him. The spell had been cast. Harlan lowered his gavel gently. "Proceed." Brutus sank back, but upright now, a sentinel. The trial continued, words twisting again, but the air had shifted. The jurors stole glances, remembering that growl, and Margaret, handkerchief pressed to her lips, felt something new rise in her chest. Not grief, but strength. Her granddaughter's voice might have been stolen, but Brutus had carried it into the room. District Attorney Henson stood, adjusting his glasses. He carried a plain box, heavy with meaning. Jurors leaned forward. "You've heard testimony," he began, "but some evidence cannot hide." He drew out a sealed bag. Inside, Lila's green bracelet, threads warped and water-stained. The frayed ends dangled like unanswered questions. "This," Henson said, "was made by Lila Carter. Her grandmother saw her tie it the morning she vanished. That afternoon, beneath a soaked rug clawed open by that dog," he gestured toward Brutus, "this bracelet was found." All eyes flicked to the shepherd. He hadn't moved, but his ears pricked, eyes glowing like coals. "Bracelets don't walk themselves under rugs," Henson said softly. "Children don't hide keepsakes under soaked floors in homes they fear. This is not an accident. This is not a coincidence. This is true." And Brutus barked, just once. It cracked the chamber like thunder, echoing in rafters, rolling across benches, lodging in marrow. Jurors flinched. One pressed her hand to her chest. The young mechanic shifted, eyes darting from Derek to the bracelet. Derek stiffened. Collier shot up, furious. "Judge, this is outrageous." "That animal's reactions are not evidence." But Harlan didn't strike his gavel. He watched the jurors' faces, then said only, "The jury will disregard the dog's reaction. Mr. Henson, proceed." But no one would forget it. Henson nodded, calm, but with a spark in his eye. He lifted the bracelet again. "This is the voice of a child who cannot sit here. You cannot hear her laughter. But this," he held it steady, "is her voice." Jurors leaned forward, sorrow and fury mingling. Margaret wept silently, her handkerchief blurring Lila's name. Brutus's gaze swept from her to Derek, unblinking. Collier rose, clipped. "Emotional manipulation. The prosecution asks you to convict on feelings." "No," Henson said evenly. "On truth. Sometimes the truth is numbers. Sometimes it's a bracelet a child wove on her grandmother's porch, and sometimes it's unearthed because a dog refused to let it stay buried." Harlan tapped his gavel once. "Proceed." Henson placed the bracelet back like it was holy. "Remember this when you deliberate. A grieving father does not hide his child's bracelet beneath a rug soaked in lies." The room exhaled, but Brutus's bark lingered, carving instinct deeper than any testimony. Derek's shoulders sagged. His mask began to slip. By evening, the courthouse was surrounded. Farmers with dirt on their boots, mothers with infants, teenagers whispering. Reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, vans clogging Main Street. Voices tangled. "Did you hear about the bracelet?" "The dog barked. I swear I heard it." Signs rose. "Justice for Lila. Protect the children." Someone sketched Brutus on cardboard. Truth has teeth. Inside, deputies urged Margaret to wait, fearing the crush. She sat hollowed, wrung dry. But when the sheriff came, she rose, slowly, but with grief-hardened resolve. The doors opened. Noise surged. Shouts, cameras, bodies pressing forward. Deputies shielded her. Voices called, "Mrs. Carter, do you believe justice will be done? Do you want to speak to Derek Cole?" She could not answer. Her throat raw, her body weak, but her silence spoke more than words. She held her head high, clutching Lila's embroidered handkerchief, and walked down the steps. Then the crowd hushed. Brutus appeared at Daniel's side, dark coat shining, stride steady. His presence parted the press of people. Someone whispered, "That's the dog." Another, "The one who found the bracelet." Silence gave way to reverence. Margaret faltered on the last step, knees trembling. Brutus pressed against her leg. His warmth anchored her. She rested a hand on his back, straightened. Reporters fell silent. Cameras clicked like church bells. From the crowd, a woman called softly, "We're with you, Margaret." Another voice rose, "Justice for Lila." The chant began, soft, then swelling until it shook the steps. "Justice for Lila. Justice for Lila." Margaret closed her eyes. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but her spine held. The sound was both comfort and burden, lifting her, reminding her. She gripped the handkerchief tighter, pressing it to her heart. Sheriff Whitaker leaned close. "You don't have to say anything. Just stand tall. They need to see you." So she did. Frail but unbroken, her hand on the dog who had become truth's symbol. Brutus sat regal, unshaken. When the chant peaked, he barked once. The sound rolled across the square. The chant faltered, then surged louder, fiercer, as if the bark had blessed their demand. Margaret swayed with exhaustion, but felt something shift. These voices weren't only for her. They were for Lila, for Anna, for every child silenced by fear. The weight was unbearable, yet shared. And in that sharing, she found strength. Deputies guided her to the waiting car. At the door, she turned back, raising the handkerchief high. The embroidered name caught the last gold of the sun. The crowd quieted, recognizing the ritual. Her voice was hoarse, but it carried, "Don't let them forget her." Silence held. Then the crowd answered, "Never, never." Margaret sank into the car, Brutus leaping in after, resting his head on her shoes. As the car pulled away, the crowd parted. Reporters scribbled, cameras flashed, but beneath it all, one truth burned steady. The town had chosen sides. They would not let Derek's smirk, Collier's words, or the absence of a body erase the child's memory. And Margaret, weary to her bones, drew a deep breath. The voices outside had become her strength. The dog at her feet had become her shield, and tomorrow, when she returned to court, she would not walk in as a broken grandmother, but as the carrier of a town's demand for justice. The third week of trial dawned heavy with expectation. Reporters crowded the courthouse steps before sunrise, voices hushed as if awaiting a sermon. Inside, the gallery filled to its edges. Neighbors, church elders, factory workers, every seat taken, every face taut with quiet urgency. The jurors filed in, weary but attentive. On the front row, Brutus lay at Daniels's feet, still as stone, ears flicking at each shuffle of paper. The clerk's voice rang out. "The state calls Dr. Helen Marks." A tall woman with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses took the stand, white blazer, crisp, manner clinical. She swore her oath, folded her hands, and met the room with calm precision. District Attorney Henson rose. "Dr. Marks, your occupation?" "I am lead forensic analyst for the State Crime Laboratory. 12 years, specializing in DNA." He lifted a bag of chestnut strands. "Did you examine this?" "Yes." Mitochondrial DNA matched the known profile of Lila Carter. The probability of error is less than 1 in a billion. The words struck like a hammer. Murmurs rippled. Margaret pressed her handkerchief to her lips, tears spilling. Jurors leaned forward, eyes dark with weight. At the defense table, Derek paled. Collier scribbled furiously, shoulders taut. Henson let silence settle. "And these tiles?" Dr. Marks glanced at notes. "Trace amounts of blood in grout near the tub. Despite degradation, a partial DNA profile consistent with Lila Carter." The jurors stiffened. One woman covered her mouth. The young mechanic clenched fists against his knees. "What does that tell you?" Henson pressed. "That she bled in that bathroom," Mark said, steady as steel. "Combined with the hair, it shows she was present and injured in that tub." A gasp broke, quickly muffled. Brutus lifted his head, amber eyes turning on Derek. No growl this time, only the quiet certainty of instinct confirmed. "And when the defendant claimed this was an accident?" Henson asked. "The evidence is inconsistent with the accident. The bracelet, hair, and blood indicate concealment." Collier leapt up. "Objection. Speculation." "Sustained," Judge Harlan ruled, but the words had sunk deep. The jurors had heard them. "No further questions," Henson said. Collier tried to pick holes, contamination, mislabeling, degraded samples. But Dr. Marks held fast, each answer clear, her calm precision cutting through every thread. Finally, Collier faltered. "No further questions." Eyes turned to Derek. His mask cracked. His hand trembled as he reached for water, the smirk long gone. Brutus lowered his head again, satisfied. Henson rose once more. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you've heard is not conjecture. It is science. Truth written in the body of a child who cannot stand here. The hair in that drain was Lila Carter's. The blood in those tiles was Lila Carter's. There is no other explanation." "Lies!" The roar ripped from Derek's throat. Chairs screeched. He lurched to his feet, face flushed red, fists clenched. "She's wrong." "You think some lab rat knows my house better than me?" "Sit down," Collier hissed, grabbing his arm. Derek jerked free, voice rising. "This is a setup. That blood could be anyone's. Hair, planted. They're all against me because I wouldn't bow down to this town." "Mr. Cole," Harlan thundered, gavel slamming. "Control yourself or be removed." But Derek only roared louder. "You think I'd hurt my little girl? She was mine. Mine. Nobody takes her from me." The gallery gasped. Jurors recoiled. One woman pressed a hand to her mouth. The mask of the grieving father shattered, leaving raw, vicious truth. Brutus shot to his feet, a guttural growl ripping free, low and lethal, vibrating in the wood itself. His eyes locked on Derek, accusing. Derek faltered mid-shout, gaze darting toward the dog. For the first time, fear broke through rage. Deputies surged, restraining him. "She was mine," he shrieked. "She belonged to me." "Nobody takes her. Not her mother, not that old hag, not this town." The words hung like fire. Collier collapsed into his chair, face pale, head in hands. Henson didn't move. He didn't need to. The jury had seen enough. Brutus remained upright, chest heaving, growl fading only when deputies forced Derek back down. The silence that followed was heavier than any testimony. Margaret closed her eyes, whispering into her handkerchief. "The truth's out now, Lila. They've heard him." Hours later, the jury retired. The heavy oak doors closed with a thud that sounded like midnight. Waiting began. The gallery emptied to whispers curling down hallways. Outside, chants rose. "Justice for Lila! Justice for Lila!" Inside, Margaret stayed seated, too weary to stand, too restless to rest. Her handkerchief was worn thin, her lips whispering one name. "Lila, stay with me." Brutus pressed against her leg, warm and steady, eyes fixed on the jury door. Waiting was his work too. Time crawled. 1 hour, 2, deputies shifted on their feet. The clock's pendulum swung louder with each tick. Margaret gripped Brutus's collar. "Don't let them forget her, boy. Don't let them forget." In the jury room, 12 people bent over evidence spread across a scarred oak table. The bracelet, the hair, the photographs. They argued, hushed but urgent. They sat silent, haunted by Derek's eruption, by the mask shattering in plain view. They could not unhear it. Back in the chamber, Margaret whispered prayers not for herself, but for Lila's memory. Henson sat with folded hands, still as a man who had handed truth to others and could only wait. Collier fidgeted, tapping his pen. Derek sat slouched, pale, jaw clenched, his bravado stripped bare. Shadows climbed the walls. The fans hummed overhead. People drifted back into the gallery, unwilling to stay away. And then, the door creaked. The foreman stepped out, folded paper in hand, face pale and unreadable. He handed it to the bailiff, who carried it solemnly to Judge Harland. "The jury has reached a verdict," Harland announced. The words echoed, heavy as a bell. Margaret pressed both hands into Brutus's collar, tears shining. "Stay with me, girl," she whispered. "We're almost there." And Brutus stood tall, ears forward, gaze locked on the bench, a silent oath in his amber eyes. He would not leave until truth was spoken. The jury filed back one by one, faces carved from stone. Not a smile, not a flicker of expression, only the weight of 12 souls carrying the truth of a town. Every step echoed. The gallery leaned forward as though pulled by one breath. Mothers clutched children. Men folded hands. Reporters scribbled, the scratching of pens, the only sound bold enough to move. Margaret trembled in the second row, fingers tangled in Brutus's collar. She whispered her granddaughter's name like a prayer. "Lila, Lila." Brutus pressed against her, amber eyes fixed on the bench. Judge Harland's voice was grave. "Members of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" The foreman rose, paper in hand. "We have, Your Honor." The slip was passed to the judge. Harland unfolded it slowly. His eyes scanned the words, then lifted. "Will the defendant please rise?" Derek stood, shoulders squared in forced defiance, pallor betraying him. His hands twitched. His lawyer whispered urgently, but Derek's eyes burned straight ahead. "On the charge of child abuse," Harland read, "the jury finds the defendant, guilty. A gasp rippled. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. Tears spilled before she could stop them. Brutus pressed closer, steadying her. On the charge of first-degree murder, the judge continued, the jury finds the defendant guilty. The words cracked like thunder. Reporters' pens flew. Neighbors gasped. A muffled cry rose from the gallery. The jurors sat pale, but resolute. Derek lurched forward, deputies gripping his arms. No. You can't do this, he howled. She was mine. Mine. Nobody takes her from me. The judge's gavel slammed. Order. You will remain silent. But Derek sagged, curses spilling meaningless from his lips. He looked less like a man than the shadow of cruelty finally cornered. Harlan's tone was final. This court sentences you, Derek Cole, to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Gasps spread. Some wept, others whispered prayers. Deputies dragged Derek away, his chains rattling. Collier slumped, papers scattered. Margaret bent forward, sobbing into the handkerchief embroidered with Lila's name. Brutus pressed his head into her lap, amber eyes unblinking. She clutched him, her grief spilling raw, yet anchored by his presence. Outside, the crowd erupted. Justice for Lila. Cheers and tears swelled into chants that shook the courthouse walls. Inside, the judge struck his gavel one last time. Court is adjourned. Reporters poured into the street. Neighbors wept openly. Deputies guided Derek through the side door. But Margaret remained, hand clutching the green bracelet the prosecutor had returned to her. She pressed it to her chest and wept. Lila, my sweet girl. Brutus padded forward, lowering his head into her lap. She clutched his fur with one hand, the bracelet with the other. Threads, tears, and sable mingling in a communion of grief and solace. For a long time, the courthouse stood as a sanctuary, benches and beams bearing witness to sorrow and comfort. Margaret pressed her forehead to Brutus's head. Thank you, boy. You brought her back. You brought her justice. Brutus exhaled, a sigh like release. At dusk, the church bell tolled. Its notes rolled across town like a call to prayer. People gathered without summons. Farmers with dirt still on boots, mothers holding children, teenagers with eyes wide. Candles flickered along the church wall. Flowers piled at the cross, roses, daisies, wildflowers. Inside, pews groaned under the weight of bodies pressed close. The altar glowed beneath stained glass, painting the sanctuary gold and violet. Margaret entered quietly, supported by neighbors, Brutus at her side. In her hand she carried the bracelet. Silence fell as she walked the aisle, the shepherd's collar jingling softly, the green threads trembling in her grasp. At the altar she paused, her breath catching. Brutus pressed against her leg. She drew strength, lifted the bracelet. Her fragile voice carried, "My Lila made this on a morning of sunlight." She tied it with hands too small to know what the world could take. I leave it here, not because she is gone, but because she will always be remembered. Her tears fell as she laid it on the altar, small, fragile, yet holding the weight of innocence and truth. Brutus sat tall beside her, amber eyes steady on the bracelet as though guarding memory itself. From the pews, a hymn rose. Amazing Grace. One voice, then another, until the sanctuary swelled. Margaret sank to her knees, Brutus lowering his head into her lap. Her sobs trembled with grief, but carried relief too, and something close to peace. When the hymn ended, the pastor spoke. Tonight we remember not only a child lost, but truth found, the courage of a grandmother, the instincts of a dog who carried what no man could. Justice, though delayed, was not denied. The congregation murmured agreement. Margaret rose slowly, hand on Brutus's head. She whispered, "Thank you for not letting her be forgotten." The church answered, "Never forgotten." One voice, then many, until it echoed like a vow. Margaret left with Brutus at her side. The night air was cool, the bracelet glowing on the altar behind her. She carried not just grief, but strength, lifted by voices, steadied by the shepherd who had refused to let lies bury truth. Brutus lifted his head toward the bell tower, ears pricked, gaze steady, as though sealing the promise the town had spoken. And in that moment, he was more than a dog. He was the living reminder that sometimes truth does not come from human voices at all, but from the unshakable instincts of loyalty, love, and devotion. Sometimes, stories like this remind us of something we already know in our hearts, that the love of an animal can be as steady as the sunrise, and that the loyalty of a German shepherd is often stronger than words. They don't speak, but in their quiet presence, they carry our burdens, steady us when we're shaken, and show us what it means to stand true. If you've ever looked into your dog's eyes and felt that bond, that silent understanding, you already know how powerful it is. And if you'd like to explore ways to deepen that connection, there are gentle resources out there that can guide you. I've found one that I think you might appreciate. I'll leave the link here if you feel like taking a look. No pressure, no hurry. Just something a friend might share over a cup of coffee. Because at the end of the day, these animals give us their whole hearts, and it's a gift worth cherishing every single day. Take care of yourself, and take care of your four-legged companion. They'll never stop taking care of you.